Alrighty, week 5 in CIT93 JavaScript. So how are you liking JavaScript so far? Just curious. Most of you, this is actually I can't even say that. Many of you, this is your first language, but not all of you. So one thing I like to say is that what we want you to do is start thinking like JavaScript, right? Because what you want to be able to do and your first develop it, your first opportunity to really create something and then come in with me and have a code review is ahead of us, right? So we're 2 weeks away from that. And that idea of understanding JavaScript, can think like JavaScript so that you can take your own ideas and express them in code is can feel like a mountain sometimes to climb, because it's like I know what I want to do, and then just getting JavaScript to do it is the challenge, and getting JavaScript to do it Rio in the way you want it written. And that's actually what I want to talk about just for a minute here. I want to, because I'm going to be taking my um, week 5 Learn Together that I rewrote, and I already have a video on that. And I want to clarify one part because Rob already asked me in chat, which, by the way, shout out to all the great interactions on chat. If you're not there, I recommend it. You can scroll back up to week 0 and see a link to that. Because the other thing is, I sometimes I get busy, like I forgot to post that I had done week 5 Learn Together, but I figured if you were that far ahead, you would have checked anyway. So tell me if that's helpful for me to post that, and I'll try to make sure I'm consistent, or I'll just see if I'll just know that you check when you're ready to look at that code. All right, so coming back around to this is that I'm going to show you what's called a style guide that I've started to develop for this course. And here's the deal, is that some of you are writing code. I can tell you've had some prior experience because you're writing the code the way you've seen it or learned it in the past. And I'm going to just tell you that even though you may know a way to do things or you're familiar with that, if you work for anybody professionally or even on an internship or whatever, you're going to probably most likely get their style guide, which means they want you to write code in this way, and not maybe write code in the way you're thinking. Actually, I'm going to go over the style guide for that I've started to create. I've just started because I noticed as I was writing my style guide, it was starting to bleed into how I want you to submit in the course, which is not really a style guide. Yeah, but you'll get the idea. So before I jump into that and take a look at it, I want to just say that I'd mentioned that on March 7th, International Women's Day is coming up. It's actually on the 8th, but the 7th is when we're celebrating it locally. And men and women are invited to this event. It's going to be down at Bitwise. It's going to be fun. There's going to be a makerspace, networking, mentor sessions. I'm going to be giving a talk on introduction to React. So if you're interested in that, should be some really good talks and just a fun day. Breakfast, it's light breakfast. We give a lunch, and then there is going to be an Eventbrite link, because there is, I think, about a $15. I don't know. I'll have to ask them about the link for that. So just know that these kind of events do happen in Fresno. Everyone's welcome. It's just a great opportunity to network with folks. So I'm going to give you a link to this in here. I'll give it in the post, but right. So here's like my style guide for 93, right? So use constant let for variable declarations. Don't use var. I haven't actually seen anybody use var, but I just want to be clear, right? Because you're getting ready to now take what you've learned and create something. Use const for function declaration and do a named function. So const do math function equals. We'll actually learn different way to do this function with an arrow function later, but for now, right, your function, your parentheses if you're passing in arguments, and then your code block. And I've shown this here as a return. You don't always have to do a return, but I just want to show you. And then declaring a variable because of the return value. right? So, and the other thing is format your code, right? So that's one thing that can be really, and maybe it's just me, but in general, you should format your code. Like I was looking at my code for here, right? And if it looks good, right? But it doesn't hurt to actually select all the code, right click and hit, and you could do the keyboard shortcuts as well, and I could do the whole document. But what it will do is format your code, because when I'm reading code, and when most of us are reading code, the way we can gives us a visual hint on what your code is doing is like you indent inside of a function, inside the block, right? So it just helps readability for us to have that format. So please, 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 you will see me. Now, what does this mean? If you don't do this, yeah, I'm going to mark off, minor points when I see it. So use it. So use camel case for variable and function declaration, right? So just get used to camel case, right? And this is why I did that. The example of lowercase, and Andrew talks about this a little bit too, is, camel case is a very common standard practice. File names need to be lowercase and don't include spaces. So the one thing, and I'm going to be working on, because I've drafted the develop at zero requirements, but I'm actually going to be doing a video, because I'm going to take my code and write some more code and make sure I've met the requirements and hopefully exceeded them, to give you other examples. But in general, I want to let you know, file names need to be lowercase. This is when you're naming your files, and no spaces. And really, if we're in Dev Zero, you'll hear me say, because I even noticed I wasn't doing it in my Learn Together, but your JS file, if you only have one, and you generally will have more as you go through development, but generally one is always app.js, especially if you only have one, right? And then here's the other thing, is most of your code needs to be inside of a function. And it's like, if you have some if blocks sitting out on the global space, you ask yourself, can I place that in a function? And the answer is almost 100% yes. I would like to hear a reasoning behind why you couldn't. Okay. And that really gets to the idea of understanding how one function calls another, and may or may not pass some values, but gets some values returned, may or may not return values. But the idea of understanding how code is what we call when the stack, one thing calls another, right? So Right. And the other thing about functions is they really don't, you shouldn't do a lot inside a function. You should really have smaller, very concise functions that don't do a lot of things, because then it's easy, if you want to change one thing about what that function is doing, it's easy to do rather than to have to remember all of why it's doing it. And when you're declaring another function, that it gives you the opportunity to then name that function, name that so that it can clearly see by the reader is what that code is doing, right? So it's another idea. And this is where I got into our class. So I just want to reiterate, make sure when you submit commits for lectures, right, you submit your commits for lectures, but for the Learn Togethers, right, you give me the link. And really, I've been now including the Git hack requirement so that we can look at it in the browser. The other thing is, we're writing code instead of having the user interact, we're just outputting. So when you're writing your code, you need to make sure your code, the number, and let me just show you here, like in my example, right? When I was processing my clients, I wanted to have client data that would then test. In this case, I only have this branch that I'm testing to make sure I have both are successful, right? But as I talked about, I simplified this code just to give you more of an example. But you're in this case, we're simulating the idea of user input, right? So you want to write input such that it tests all aspects, all branches, right? Your if branches of your code. And then again, these are kind of like not they're seeping out of style and seeping more into just best practice, but use developer tools for walking through and troubleshooting your code, right? So I haven't been as like on the Learn Togethers where I actually go and run everybody's code. I can kind of look at it and know, but know that when we get to the develop it, right, that I will. That will be an important aspect of that I'm hitting the wrong keyboard. It'll be an important part of that you actually do have working code. So it is really important for you to be running code that test all your branches, that you, if you are having issues, that Chrome Developer Tool is really helpful, right? So this week, as we move into week 5, we're breaking up the last section on arrays and loops into 2 weeks. So this is part of why this week I gave you, instead of a coding requirement for your Learn Together, is I really wanted you to start thinking about what your functions are going to do. And so Rob had asked me, so I needed to at least, show you, because I did it in the video, but if he asked me, that must mean it wasn't clear. So in your submission for week 5, right, I want you to create a markdown file that describes, it gives an overall overview, kind of what you did for your description in last night's work, where you said what the target, what the concept for your your first dev project will be. Right? And then this was like that for me. And again, I want to expand on this, but then I said I'll have 4 functions. I've only documented 3, and it doesn't have to be a lot of documentation. But again, the idea here is that you're giving it some thought, like, what is my code going to do? What do I want it to do? Right? Because the more you've thought about code and committing it to words makes you actually think through that process, right? The more likely you're going to write good code because you've thought about it. Because here's what often happens is people just sit down and start coding something without thinking about it. And in real world, that doesn't happen. Typically, oftentimes, especially depending on the size of, we call it shop that you're working in, right? You're going to be given requirements, or you're going to have to write those requirements, like, what I'm going to write code that does this, and this is how that code is going to function. So, just know that this is very common, that you have to think about code before you write it, and it makes you write better code. So I had yesterday went through and looked at everyone that had submitted by early afternoon for Learn Together, and I looked at the rest of them this morning, and there is, it's really such a fun thing to do. Look at all the code. There was only one example where I actually didn't, because it was so big. There was so much code in there, right? Remember, if you're writing code beyond the scope of this class, you need to make sure you're documenting so your fellow students can learn from that. And they had an issue that I'm going to go back today and actually see if I can find some time in my schedule to look at that in more detail. So, enough for today. Last thing I will leave you with is that the Women in STEM meeting, first one is today. If you want to know more about that meeting, it's going to happen, I think, once a month at Fresno City College in the Math, Science, and Engineering building. So it'd be great to have you join if you're interested. And in this case, yeah, you need to be female to go. Let me know, and I will help you find a way to that meeting. Otherwise, have a great week, okay? Come see me if you need. I've already been talking to some of you, seeing me in my office. I always love talking to students about code, or just about life, or about how do you, what's the process to get jobs. And please come talk to me. And even if you can't come talk to me, video. Let's do video, man. Or woman, or whatever. Let's do that, because that's another way you can get support, or just have a chat if you want to. Because remember, you're going to have to be talking to me anyway on week 6 about your code. So maybe a little pre-code review. And I'll be talking about code reviews. I said I was going to end, but I actually do have the code review schedules that I will release when I release next week's video for week 6. Anyway, peace out.